Yeah. ঠিক আছে না? Right. So, yeah, it's visible to me. I hope it's visible to everyone. No, if you can, is it possible to enhance it a little bit? I mean, magnify it a little bit. ये भी लड़का था. Yeah, it's fine now. So this first question, actually, this is the question which forms the basis of our discussion today. And probably I'll be taking it up when we go to the presentation. The question is that whether as a bank or any prudent lender, whether you'll be interested in granting a loan to a company which has no operations, no credit history, no employees. And interestingly, we have about close to 85% people who have responded in no. And only 15% odd people believe that we can lend to such company. So this is an interesting question which relates to the core of discussion today. So I'll come to that when we start giving our presentation. You can move to the next question, Gokul. Yeah. So in case of a company defaults in the loan obligations, so what are the scenarios which can happen? So 82% of people have responded that you can only go after the company's assets, while 14% people believe that you can go after the company's assets as well as the shareholders' assets. And I think there are some people, about 4%, who have said that you can also go after the board of directors of the company. Now, this question goes back to the basics of the Companies Act when we learned that there is a corporate will which is created. So if a company takes a loan, unless there is a security provided by the shareholders or shareholders' skin is also there in the game, you can only go after the company's assets. And I'm glad that majority of the students have responded, correct answers in this. Yeah. Gokul, can you mute everyone else? I think I can see a lot of echo while I speak.
All right, sir.
Yeah, Gokul, you can move to the next question now.
Right.
So this is interesting. The question was, what will be considered as better security by a lender? And I think 65% people have responded saying depends on the facts, which also to an extent is correct. Then next is 20% people who have said mortgage. 7.5% people have said all are equals. And I think very minimal people have said pledge and hypothecation. So the answer here may surprise you. For a lender, the best security form is pledge. That is how it is perceived in the industry. Because what happens in pledge? In pledge, you have the possession of the asset. I can still hear echo. So pledge, because in case of a pledge, you have the assets with you. The possession of the assets is there with you. So when it comes to enforcement, you can enforce it without any difficulty whatsoever. Whereas in case of hypothecation, mortgage, or any other security, as a first step, you will have to go and take possession of the assets. So therefore, for a lender, the best form of security is pledge. Also linked with the fact that the shares can be pledged, and that enables the lender to change the ownership. But as you can see, most of the people have, there are very few people who have voted for the pledge of shares. Our pledge of shares or the pledge of the assets is the best form of security considered by the lenders, because you have the ability to start the enforcement without any interference whatsoever, because you are already in possession. Now, can we move to the next question? Yeah, this is interesting. We have a divided house here. The question was that if a company which is bound by a contract not to create security on its assets. If that company creates a security in favor of mortgage, what is the validity of the mortgage? And I can see there are 40% people who have said that such mortgage can be enforced only with the consent of such third party. There are 22% people who believe that mortgage is enforceable, and there are 37% people who says that it can be enforced by the banks. So, well, the answer is that it can be enforced by the banks because the contractual remedy is different and a security enforcement is different scenario. So when you enter into a contract with a third party, the recourse which third party may have in this case, with whom you have entered into a contract not to create a security, is probably they can sue you for the damages. They can probably ask the other remedies or the contractual remedies which may be there in that contract. But once you create a security, simply because you have a contract with a third party who has prohibited you from creating a mortgage, will not come in your way. So that is how the Indian law is actually evolved. Whereas in case of a foreign jurisdiction, the things are different. There, the contractual enforcement may have a interference with the security enforcement. Here, so long as there is no security created previously, it does not matter whether you have a third-party contract prohibiting you to create the security. So as you can see, this this is a question where we have a divided house. I'm still glad at least 40% people have been able to have a correct answer on that. We can move to the next question. Yeah, so the question was, if a shareholders provide a guarantee to secure the loan taken by the company, which is in most of the cases, what will be the treatment of that loan, whether that loan is considered a secured loan or unsecured loan, or again, it depends on the facts. And as I can see, majority of the people, around 67%, have said it will be treated as secured loan. And only 16% people believe it will be unsecured loan, and 15% believe it depends on the facts. Well, the answer is that it will be unsecured loan. And that answer may surprise you, because normally we treat guarantee as a security. But in the sense of security, which is considered in the Companies Act for creation of charge or for the enforcement, it is not a secured loan. Even from the insolvency perspective, if a guarantee holder tomorrow lodges a claim against the company, he will be standing in the queue along with the unsecured creditors. So essentially, this loan will be considered unsecured loan, and they will be at a lower pedestal than a secured lender. I think this was the last question. So why we have put all these questions so that to set the tone of the discussion. And while we discuss the presentation today, you will see how each of these questions are relevant in context of the project financing. Now I'll share my presentation. I'll start with the presentation. Is it visible, Gokul?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay. So before we go on to the discussing what exactly the project finance, and just for everyone's benefit, I've kept the presentation very, very simple in easy to understand language, because project finance otherwise may sound to you very complex concept, but I've kept it very simple so that you can understand the basic contours of the project. We are not going to discuss the nitty-gritties of the project finance today, because it's a whole lot of jurisprudence which has evolved over the years, and it may take us many years to understand those concepts, but the basic contours can be discussed. So when we go to discuss the concept, the entire project finance concept lies in this question, which we have also included in our questionnaire, that how will you convince a lender to provide a loan to a company which has no credit history, no track record, no employees, it has never operated, it has never generated any cash, and there is no guarantee from anyone. Well, it may sound very, so to say, stupid or defying all the prudent lending norms, because who will lend to such a company which has all these traits? None of these traits are, a very confidence booster, but you would be surprised to know that entire project finance principle is based on lending to such companies. So what we do in project finance, is lend to such companies which has no credit history, which has no track record, there are no employees, it has never operated, it has never generated any cash, and there is no guarantee to secure such loans. So how do we do that? The answer to that lies in the concept of the non-recourse lending, which is again the core concept of the project finance. The project finance per se is called non-recourse lending. Now, what is a non-recourse lending? The non-recourse lending is essentially when you don't have a recourse beyond the company to the shareholders or the promoters. So how does this happen? So in project finance, what you do essentially, you form a new company, which is a fresh company incorporated only to undertake a specific project. So whether it is Tata's or whether it is Mahindra's who are developing these projects, they will always form a fresh company. And then the fresh company will undertake the project. It will take loan for setting up the projects like road projects or port projects or any infrastructure projects, power plants, etc. And the key here is that recourse by the lender is restricted to the SPVs, and there is no recourse against the shareholders or the promoters. So whether the project has been set up by Tata, Birla, or Ambani, the recourse is restricted to that particular company. The lenders cannot go after the other businesses which Tata, Mahindra, or the Birla may have. And as you know, this company does not have any assets. So therefore, it's a very difficult situation for the lenders. So what are the securities which you provide for here? Securities are the assets of the SPVs again. So the company which has been incorporated, which is normally called special purpose company or special purpose vehicle company. So in this presentation, we'll name it as SPC. So the SPV's assets are the only security which you have. You don't have any security of the shareholders' assets or any of their other businesses which are ongoing. And generally, I say generally because now we have started seeing in India that you also lenders, because they're not very comfortable going forward, they take guarantees, but generally there is no guarantee or collateral provided by the promoters. So take a contrast with the home loan. When you go for the home loan as a collateral, you have the house, but when you go to fund a solar project, there is nothing, and the recourse of the lenders is only restricted to the assets of the solar projects, which you go to sell in the market. It will be sold as a scrap because you have all the panels and nothing else. So what is the strength which lenders derive, and from where they derive to fund these projects? The answer is cash flows. A cash flow of the company is what gives the strength to the lenders to lend for such projects. And again, I'll draw a parallel from the home loan. So in case of a home loan, let's say you have the collateral, the value of the home, which is there as a security, and the loan is granted based on the estimated value of the home. And you see, any kind of home loan you take, normally you between 75 to 80% is provided by the bank, and around 20 to 25% you will be asked to put in. That will be your down payment, as you normally say. So what lender is essentially doing in a home loan, by putting in 80% of the money, they are getting an asset worth 100%. So normally they are more than secured, and the likelihood of default, the lenders do get a home. The value of the home or value of the house is more than the loan which they have granted. So that way they are secured. But in this case, there is no secure. It is not based on the value of the collaterals. Rather, it is based on the value of the cash flows. So if we take an example of the road project, let's say, so road project has the cash flows in the forms of toll revenue, which are collected. So what lenders do a calculation that what is the toll revenue, what is the traffic situation in that particular stretch, and what is the likelihood of the monthly or yearly revenue. And they do a calculation projections for a year-on-year basis, let's say 20 years. So if I'm granting a 20-year loan, I will do a projection of the toll revenues for the 20 years. And I will see that after doing an operation and maintenance of the road and taking care of the construction, if the cash flows will be able to support my repayment. If I have the confidence in the cash flows that yes, the cash flows will be able to support the debt repayment or repayment of my loan, then that particular project passes the muster and the project is granted sanction. The other thing which is kept in mind is the is the life cycle of a project. So let's say in a typical scenario of a solar project normally have a life cycle of 25 years or 30 years sometimes. So overall life cycle of the project, you estimate how much cash flow it is going to produce, and it is never remain the same. For example, in case of a solar project, over the later part of the life cycle of the project, the panel starts degrading. So while in initial years you get 100% output in terms of 100% electricity, but towards, let's say, last 5 years, the panels will not be as effective as they were at the initial time. So this entire life cycle of the project and the projected cash flows are taken into account while sanctioning the loan by the lenders. Another thing which is peculiar in this case is that sometimes these projects are cyclical in nature. For example, if we take example of the solar projects or the wind projects, as you all know, the solar projects are based on the sunlight. And we are all aware that sunlight is not available for, let's say, 3-4 months in a year. During the monsoon, it is not, you don't see sun every day. So therefore, this is called cyclical nature of a project, wherein, let's say, the lean period has to compensate, the peak period has to compensate for the lean period. So in case of a solar project, we can say roughly around 5-6 months are the peak period, wherein, in summers and in winters, you have bright sunny days and you get the required amount of sunlight to produce the electricity. But in 3-4 months, when the monsoon time, you don't have that kind of sunlight. So that is the lean period. Project ought to generate a lesser cash flow. So this cash flow, which is there at the peak time, has to compensate for the lesser cash flow. And lenders always do this calculation while they are projecting for the debt service payment. And they make sure that the surplus available during the peak time is retained with the company, so that when there is a lean time, it can support the cash flow and the debt service payment of the lean time. Another example, let's say wind project. In a wind project, what you do essentially, wind project has a lean time of, I think, 5 to 6 months. So what happens is that for 5 to 6 months, you have about 40% capacity, and the 60% electricity is generated only in 4 months. So these calculations are done by the lenders when they go for the cash flows. Now, another thing, there may be cash flow in the company, but what happens, and you must have heard these in the news, that the many companies do siphoning of the funds, even though the project generates cash flow. But if that cash flow is not reaching out for the construction, operation, maintenance, and also the repayment of the lenders, then it is of no use. So what lenders do normally, they put up in place a escrow mechanism, wherein the lenders ask the borrower company to close all the other accounts and ask them to retain only one account, the control of which account is maintained with the lenders. So lenders make sure that the cash flow is deposited into that particular account only, and then it is utilized only as per the waterfall priority. So that way, lenders have a control as to how that money is being utilized, and in case they see that money is being not utilized for the purpose for which it has been taken, let's say it is not being utilized for the construction, then because they have the control of the bank account, so they can give instructions that the money should be transferred only with the instructions of the lenders. Moving to the next slide. So what is the security typically provided for in a case of project finance? So typical security, as we discussed, is the cash flows of the SPVs. Then we have the pledge of SPV shares. So SPV shares are pledged to the lenders, and they are pledged in such a manner that they can give effective control of the company in the event lenders were to invoke the security. Why this is done is because, let's say hypothetically, a project is not doing so well. However, it is in the operations phase. You cannot, like I said, you cannot disintegrate a wind farm and sell the blade separately, sell the rotor separately, and the land separately, because that will not fetch you the returns equivalent to the loan which you have given. So therefore, what lenders would want to do typically, they will invoke the pledge of shares, they will change the ownership and try to find another borrower, another company. Let's say if a Mahindra company fails to implement the project, they will probably go out in the market and see if another borrower is there who can implement the project. So then they invoke the pledge, change the ownership, and get a new borrower who steps into the shoes of this borrower. So then he becomes a borrower to that particular loan, and he operates the project and makes sure that the cash flows are being utilized to repay the lenders. A lender's right of substitution is the same thing which you talked about, wherein lenders want to keep that right, retain that right, because that is the primary security which they are relying on. In case of project finance, there is nothing else than the project which can fetch the lenders the kind of repayment they are looking at. So therefore, they want someone to run the project throughout the tenure of the project to make sure that their repayments are coming on in timely manner. Termination payment is another security which is there. Now, what is termination payment? Termination payment is a payment which is agreed by, if I take an example of a road project. So NHAI is the authority which grants a road project. So let's say I have given I've given a loan to a company, and company enters into a concession agreement, which is essentially the agreement authorizing the company to operate the road with NHAI. So now this concession agreement has provisions which provide that the termination payment has to be given irrespective whether it is the fault of the company or whether it's fault of the NHAI. Why this is so? Because this is to ensure the bankability of the project. So if a lender lends a road project, and in a road project, there is other than road, there is nothing which can give a sense of security to the lender. So lenders would want to make sure that in case the agreement is terminated and road goes back to NHAI, then they have some way to recover their debt. So therefore, to make sure that the projects are bankable, you'll see the concession agreements will contain these provisions between the NHAI and the company that irrespective whose fault it is, if the agreement is terminated, NHAI pays to the borrower money equivalent to the loan of the lenders. So you may find it little hard to digest that why should NHAI pay to the concessionaire or the company if the company is in default? But NHAI undertakes to pay this to make sure that the lenders are secured. Lenders have that confidence that yes, tomorrow, even if NHAI takes over the road project back, their loan will still be repaid. And last is that you also create security on the fixed and movable assets of the SPV. So whatever I explained, if I can sum up in terms of what exactly project finance entails. So project finance is funding of the long-term projects, where the loans are secured by a charge on the assets of the company. Again, to remind you, charge is only on the assets of the company and not on the shareholders. The repayment of debt is secured by the cash flows, and lenders are primarily relying on the cash flows of the company. It's a non-recourse lending, which means that you don't have a recourse against the shareholders or against their business or against assets of the shareholders. Your recourse is limited to the assets of the company only. And there is a specified order of priority in which the cash flows have to be utilized. Yeah. Now, I'll quickly run you through what are the stages of the project finance. So the first stage is identification, wherein you will identify a project, and then you go to the project appraisal, wherein you will appraise the project on the basic yardsticks as to whether that project, if we take example of, let's say, road project, what kind of road traffic is expected, whether it is sufficient to cover the construction, operation, and the debt service amount. Then you still see the promoters standing in the market. And let's say promoter is formulating a company who has already a track record of implementing 10 successful projects, then that plays in favor of the project which you are sanctioning. Then you float an information memorandum which contains details of the projects to the prospective people who would like to come and invest. Then sanction is granted to the company, and then the financing documents are executed, and then there is a syndication. So banker, normally these are huge amounts which a single bank cannot take. So what they do, they initially underwrite the project, wherein they say that yes, in case nobody comes, I will give 1,000 crores. But what they do subsequently, out of that 1,000 crores, let's say they've identified 4-5 lenders who can take 200 crores each, so that the lenders have a limited exposure. Now, what are the factors which affect the structuring? The factors which affect the structuring of the document are the type of the project, what type of project you're funding, whether it is whether it is road, whether it is airport, whether it's port, whether it is thermal project, renewable project, and lot of structuring of the documents will revolve around that. For example, in case of a PPP project, which is the public-private partnership project, you make sure that the conditions of the concession agreement, which is essentially the agreement granting the authority to implement the project, they are adequately represented in the financing documents. Then what are the nature of the assets which are there, movable or immovable assets? Stamp duty is a very, very big consideration. And you would be surprised to know that there are many deals which fall off only because there are huge stamp duty implications and people are not able to do efficient structuring to avoid or mitigate the stamp duty. And it also depends on the nature and requirement of the lenders. I will very briefly touch upon the escrow arrangement, which I talked about. So escrow is essentially, as I told you, the lenders ask the company to close all the other accounts which they have and retain only one account in which all the cash flow of the project is deposited. And then they provide the waterfall as per which the money has to be utilized. Now, what is that waterfall? That waterfall is as presented here in this slide. So first of all, whatever money is deposited, it has to be utilized for the tax repayment first. Now, why would a lender want to make sure that the company is paying tax? Because ultimately, all the lenders should be worried about is the repayment. So long as the lenders are getting their repayment installment on timely manner, they should not be bothered. But the answer to that is because if you read the IT Act or you read any other statutory provisions of the fiscal legislations, all of them have the provision which says that the tax dues have a first charge over the assets of the company. So in case there is a default by the company in paying its tax obligations, the assets of the companies are deemed to be charged to that outstanding of the tax department, which means that the assets which are secured to me become also vulnerable in case the company is not paying its tax efficiently or adequately. And therefore, lenders would want to make sure that company is paying its taxes. Then construction expenses. Then as a lender, I want to make sure that after the construction or the operation and maintenance expenses, my loan repayment installments come. Then the lenders want to create certain kind of delta to make sure that lean periods, they have sufficient reserve. So like I give you an example of the solar project wherein 4 months are the lean period and 6 months are the peak period. So during those 6 months, whatever surplus money is generated, lenders want that surplus money to have some sort of reserve within the company so that during the lean period when the company does not have that kind of cash flow, the loan prepayment can be secured by the surplus cash flow and ultimately the surplus money which the borrower can then utilize as per his own wishes. In terms of enforcement, the typical enforcement scenario is that you would want to have the right to substitute the borrower, and this is the this is the fundamental security which the lenders want in these cases. Because as I told you, if you go to sell the project in bits and pieces, you won't get the value more than an scrap value. So therefore, you need to have someone. You need to have the ability to replace the borrower by someone who can operate the project for the rest of the tenure and repay your loan. Invocation of the pledge we have already talked about. Then the typical remedies which the lenders keep, that is to seize, recover and receive the assets, appointing a receiver, and sometimes when you have the guarantees from the promoters, they invoke the guarantees. What are the statutes which are involved? So these are the statutes which are normally involved in the project finance transaction. The Companies Act, the provisions of the Companies Act, like provision relating to charge filing, provision relating to the authorization, signing of the contract, Indian Contract Act, your concepts of the bail, bailment and pledge. They are very, very important in terms of the securities which are created. Transfer of Property Act, all your concept of mortgage which you learn here, which Kareta teaches us, all of them actually are put to use in practical. Hello? Yeah, in terms of the practical implementation, then Indian Trust Act, and then lot of ancillary statutes like Indian Stamp Act, SURFACE Act, DRT Act, Insolvency Act, which come into play when you go for the enforcement of the security. Now we come to the last slide of the presentation, which talks about what is the role of the lawyers. So here I want to emphasize, while we understand that the lawyers are typically supposed to provide comments on the legal subjects or legal concepts, for example, jurisdiction, for example, stamp duty, for example, arbitration, dispute resolution. However, expectation from a corporate lawyer is that you have to go into the realm of the commercial lawyering also, which means that you have to have a sound knowledge of the commercial concepts, and you are expected to have a negotiation on the commercial aspects of this. So what and all we do here when we say that we are working on a project finance transaction, a drafting of the financing documents and negotiations, you have to have the sound understanding of the commercial concepts. As I told you, you should be able to highlight the risk and also provide mitigation. Simply highlighting risk is not enough. Companies, they do not appreciate lawyers who are very technical and who only highlight risk. See, it is very easy to highlight risk because no document is perfect. And in today's scenario, every business is risky. So you should have the ability not only to highlight the risk, but also provide what are the mitigants. So unless you are able to provide mitigants, you would not be seen as a good lawyer, howsoever strong technical knowledge you may have. Knowledge of the market precedents is very important. Then structuring of the transaction to make sure that you are efficiently saving the tax, efficiently mitigating the stamp duty implications is very, very important. Ring fencing the company. Ring fencing means you have to create a structure where company is insulated from all other liabilities. Cash flow of the companies are insulated from all other liabilities, so that lenders are secured that on those cash flows, nobody else can lodge a claim. Then advising on the compliances which are internal and external. When I say internal compliances, I mean the resolutions which companies are required to pass, the various committees which the companies may have, the contracts which the companies may have. All those need to be taken care. And then advising on the stamp duty, wherein you have to advise on the stamp duty and also come up with the structures which can mitigate the stamp duty implication. Because as I told you, these are the huge stamp duty implications. We have seen cases where the stamp duty implication itself was to the tune of thousands of crores, and because of which deals fell through. So therefore, structuring in such manner is very, very important. Now, with this, we come to the end of the session. I hope it was of interest to you. We have received certain questions, I think, during the session.
Yes, sir. So we have questions from a fifth student, Shefali Chawla. Sir, in the chat box.
Yeah. So I think the first question is from Shefali. And question is, how common are smart contracts in the project finance mechanism in India, considering the fact that these are largely financial transactions contingent upon supply chain obligations? What are the problems lawyers face in terms of enforcing indemnities and other terms of such contracts? In the circumstances that these are widely used contracts in the project financing. I am sorry. I think I've been able to get the gist of the. There's a lot of echo. Can I request everyone else to put the mics on mute? Yeah. So to answer your question, Shefali, in terms of the enforcement, enforcing indemnity is very, very difficult in India, not only for the project finance transactions, but for any contract. And reasons for that is that we have a very lengthy process. So sorry, I can still hear a lot of echo. Gokul, is it possible for you to put everyone else on mute? Yeah. So enforcing the indemnities particularly is very difficult. That I agree, because that is not peculiar to the financing transactions. Any contract in India which you enter into, you will see one para or two para, sometimes a page of indemnity. But it is very difficult to enforce those indemnities because one, it is very difficult to prove that loss was caused because of the action or inaction of the counterparty. And second, our judicial system is such because these are civil cases and they take a lot of time. So therefore, you don't see those indemnities getting enforced that often. But yes, we have landmark cases where indemnities have been enforced. And particularly, these indemnities are more relevant not from the project finance perspective, but when you go for a M&A transaction, wherein the entire transaction is based on certain reps and warranties which are given by a counterparty. And in spite of all your diligence, you cannot find out how many litigations are there against that particular company which you're planning to acquire. So in that case, the indemnity becomes very relevant. And we have seen cases where those indemnities have been successfully implemented. And in terms of the smart contracts in the project finance mechanism in India, see, it is possible, and we have seen very, very tightly drafted contracts, especially if you talk about the foreign lenders. The foreign lenders are very, very particular about having a very crisp contract. So if you see a contract signed by a foreign lender, those will be very, very crisp and tight contracts, let's say of 80, 90 pages. Whereas if you see the contracts signed by the Indian lenders, they are very verbose. So you will see a lot of repetition. These contracts are 150 pages or 160 pages. So see, the basic principle of drafting is there should not be any repetition, because if there is a repetition of the same concept, the likelihood of reproducing the same thing with the same intent is very, very rare. So if you have two clauses covering the same thing, there may be a scope of ambiguity, there may be a scope of confusion, and sometimes the counterparties do take advantage of that. So therefore, while drafting these contracts, the basic principle which has to be kept in mind, that avoid repetition, because the intent which you capture at one clause, it's not possible to capture as it is the same intent in the another clause. If that was possibility, why should you reproduce the same thing exactly in the same manner at two places? So long as our drafting is crisp and the commercial intents are clear, yes, it is possible to have a very cleverly drafted contract with a crisp and tight language. And we come across such cases. For example, Asia Pacific Loan Market Association, which is a body responsible for developing standard contracts. If you see any of their standard contracts, they are very, very well drafted, tightly drafted contracts used for the project finance transactions. Another question is there from Nikhil. The question is, what government approvals are required for typical project finance transactions? See, so approval required would depends on the nature of the project. For example, in a road project, the approvals would be from NHAI. If you're constructing and there is a forest area involved, then you'll need the environmental clearance. If it requires the mining work, then you need approval from the mining inspector, you need the approval from the local panchayats, you need approval from the collectors. So it actually depends on the type of project which you are undertaking. And there are a whole list of the clearances which are required based on the type of the projects. And as in India, you don't have a consolidated single window system where you can see a particular project requires X number of clearances. So yes, it becomes a tedious process for someone who is undertaking that project for the first time. But after you have undertaken one project, you come to know what kind of clearances are required, and then it becomes easier for the person to implement it in the second project. Again, question from Sefali, which is, apart from the concession agreements, what are the other widely used form of agreements in these circumstances that government authorities are not involved? So see, all these power projects which are there, in those power projects, essentially you don't have a direct government intervention, but still have a DISCOM, which is there, and you sign a power purchase agreement. So that way, a government intervention is still there. But all these manufacturing contracts, all these companies which are setting up the steel plants, or let's say a captive power project wherein you produce electricity for your own consumption, which is called captive power project. Those are the kind of projects where you don't have any direct interaction with the government. The project is not granted by the government. It's a privately owned contract, and all the counterparties are also private. So those are some of the examples of the contracts where government authorities are not involved. Then next question is, Yeah, Gokul, if you can read the next question, I think.
Yes, sir. So next question is from Pulkit Zamindar. He's a fifth year student. Whether pledge of shares is also governed by any other law apart from the contract law, since there is no transfer of possession in pledge of shares, whereas possession is essential under contract law for pledge.
No, so pledge of shares is essentially governed by the contract law only, because it is the Indian Contract Act which defines pledge, and the basic principles of pledge and the quantity of pledge is defined there. It is no different when you pledge a particular good or whether you pledge a share. The essential concept of the contract still remains same. The only thing which differs in case you are doing a pledge of shares, that let's say if the shares are in a demat form, which is not in the physical form, then then Depositories Act also comes into play, because depositories are the authorities which hold the shares in demat form, dematerialized form. So there, the government has passed a separate act called the Depositories Act, which governs the procedure of pledging the shares in case the shares are in demat form. But that only governs the procedure. However, so far as the concepts of pledge are concerned, they are solely governed by the contract law. There is no other law which governs the concepts of the pledge. The procedures may differ, and they may, based on whether shares are in physical format or the dematerialized format, the procedures may be governed by the different statutes.
So we have one more question. It's from Ishan Chopra, fifth year student again. Sir, in IL&FS restructuring, ring fence projects which had sufficient cash have been included in the resolution process of the sponsor. What are your views on the same? Doesn't it affect the creditors who gave money relying on the separateness?
See, that's right. So ILFS case should not be taken an example ever, because that's a peculiar case wherein you will see a lot of contradictory judgments, lot of orders by NCLT, wherein it seems that NCLT has gone probably beyond the jurisdiction which was bestowed on it. And you're right, to that extent, it actually defies the concept of the project finance and entire ring fencing which we are talking about. However, so like I said, ILFS is not a good example to follow, and that's a very, very specific case. And the NCLT orders which have been passed there cannot be applied generically. So let's say if your answer is that, if your question is that if I'm funding a normal wind project, a Tata is putting up a project in the same manner, and he's paying for the project financing, whether the cash flows of that will be insulated, the answer is yes. The cash flow will still be insulated, because NCLT judgment on the ILFS is only applicable for the peculiar cases where NCLT is gone and exercised extraordinary jurisdiction under section 60 or 64, and those are specifically applicable only to ILFS cases. There also, if you see going forward, some bit has been recorrected. NCLT and government has corrected itself. So if you see the plans which are being submitted now, they are based on the ring fencing of the cash flows. So there were only one or two judgments which actually tried to defy the basic concept of the ring fencing. But like I said, those cannot be treated as a precedent for us.
If the participants have any more questions, kindly write them in the chat box. So I think we'll wait for 30 more seconds, and then.
Sure. In the meanwhile, can I request our teachers or faculty who are present here just to give some comments whether I passed in the exam, because these are the teachers who have taught me, and it's a proud privilege that today I am able to say something while all of them are here. So I would be happy if we can have some comments from the teachers who are present here. Uday sir is throwing thumbs up. That's a no, Alam sir. I want to hear from you, sir. You only the thumbs up will not do, sir. You have to say something.
Alam sir is speechless at your presentation.
Thank you, Anurag. It was really good to hear you and hear from the students. Earlier, I heard Monica. Today, you are Anurag was speaking on behalf of Monica because there are two Monica Sarua. There's no Anurag Dwivedi. Anyway, on the may I suggest that when you are doing project financing, if you can organize your discussion on the lines of immutable rules which are applicable in project financing, then default rules, if you can capture them, and then there are some opt-in rules
Sure,
around which project financing or any other type of contract is organized. So some fundamentals of that may be more helpful to the students and particularly the beginners. And some more light on escrow account, that how it is used, what are the advantages and disadvantages. Overall, I'm very happy, because it's a Sunday, and on Sunday you are working, and it's good for everybody and for all the students and participants that we are trying, and in a way, pandemic has been liberating for us, that we have been able to be in touch. Otherwise, even if students come to the campus, they deliver lecture. Some of us are there, some of us are not there. But what I find that it's more liberating. It's more liberating that we are connecting more and more. So thank you very much. And I'll also request MCA to involve other alumni for such type of talk and lectures. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alam sir. As always, your comments were apt and very to the point comments, and I'm sure MC has taken note of the requirements here. So we can probably have another session wherein we capture uh, the contours which you have mentioned today, because I think it will require a full-fledged session on these topics only. So we can organize that for a later session, sir. I can see Mukesh sir also have joined. Hello, Mukesh sir. I think, sir, you're on mute.
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, sir.
Oh, good. It was wonderful to see your face. And well, I couldn't follow much of your talk, I must say, but then it's very good to hear you. And maybe we can take more questions from other participants. And you also wanted to talk about career choices, right?
Right, sir. Right, sir. So that is the second part which we are going to move on now. So,
okay.
So we have one more question.
Yeah.
From Shamantak Sena, 4th year student.
Mm-hmm.
Are there instances when, due to delays in governmental approvals, the cost of the project increases and it becomes unsustainable for the lender? How do the parties usually proceed in such case?
It's a very good question, and answer to that is that there are plethora, number of cases wherein the costs of the projects have overshoot, and there has been a huge cost overrun. And if you see the insolvency cases which are there in the infrastructure space, I would say more than 50% cases are on account of such scenarios. While delay in the project are not always on account of the delay from the government, but yeah, majority of the cases, there is some element of the government delays are also involved, specifically in the projects which are concession based, like port, airport, road. These are the projects wherein wherein the responsibility of acquiring and giving the land is on the government. And most of the cases, the lands, there's a problem in getting the right of way because there are some litigations, there is some forest land involved, there are some agitation, some litigation have been filed. So more often than not, the timelines which are agreed for the implementation, they are always breached, and therefore there are cost overruns. What lenders do to make sure that they are not affected to the extent, they also take a cost overrun undertaking, wherein they say that in case the cost overshoots the expected budget which lenders have assessed, then they ask the shareholders, the promoters, to give an undertaking that they will bring in the cost overrun. And what happens that while the entire responsibility is bestowed on the promoters in theory, practically what happens when the cost overrun happen, you again reassess the project. And if you think that with some bit of debt infusion, you will be able to still complete the project. So you again give extra funding to project on the same ratio. So normally, typically the ratio of the debt and equity in a project finance scenario is, let's say, 70-30, sometimes even 65-35 or 75-25. 70-30 is the ideal ratio which is there. So the subsequent cost overrun is also funded on a 70-30 ratio. And in my experience, whatever cost overruns which have happened so far in the projects, only 50% projects have been able to achieve the financial closure or the completion. And the balance 50% cases are those which we have seen now, they have been referred to insolvency. So yeah, it's difficult, but that's how the infrastructure financing space is.
Okay, Anurag, it's nice listening to you, Anurag. You are very to the point now, without much ado. I just have one question. For example, there are investors, and the project is say set across 2 countries, right? And in that case, like ILFS, since you are already also in ILFS many years ago, there is a project cost where you find that it escalates to such an extent that why double taxation comes into picture. That one country is there where the taxations are so much, both countries, that the company doesn't make profit. Like and its entire profit goes through paying taxes for first initial 3 years or so. Now what? And since you don't have a recourse of the shareholders' assets, you only have a company, and that company, primary company you gave in, he also got into insolvency, and there is no arbitration clause.
Right.
So what is the procedure of getting back the money to the lenders?
So, sir, the basic premises of funding an infrastructure project is, sir, that it's non-recourse lending. So the risk allocation is what, how the risk allocation happens, sir. For example, in given case which you're talking about, if the double taxation has happened because of some change in law, let's say if it has happened after you have granted the loan to the project and subsequently change in law happens, then I'm sure that change in law will also have, there'll be the concession agreement or whatever agreement which may have been signed with the government authorities. There will be adequate protections under change in law, which gives you, the delta that if there is a change in law and because of that there is an escalation in project cost, the government says that we will also bear that. So that is the first recourse which you have if it has happened after you have sanctioned the loan and on account of some change in policy. But let's say if that has not happened because of the change in law, which means that the policies were there from day one, which means that at that time when you sanction the project appraisal itself should have caught that, because then double taxation has not come up all of a sudden. It was there right on the day one when the project was sanctioned. So my guess is, sir, that in that event, the lenders will not give money to such projects if they already have a risk visibility of the risk on account of the taxations, that the double taxation will itself be so much that the entire cost will overshoot and the cash flow from the project will go only towards that. But like I said, sir, in case it happens after the sanction has been given, after project has been already implemented, then there are adequate risk mitigations which are built in the concession agreements and also to the extent in the loan agreement. The loan normally, sir, what happens, because lenders, they are not party to these contracts which the companies signed with the government authorities. So they have to largely rely on the risk mitigation which may be there in these contracts. So lenders do study these contracts very, very carefully to see that adequate risk mitigations are already built in on account of change in law, on account of force majeure, or on account of any other unforeseen circumstances. And they lend to the project only after being reasonably sure that sufficient risk mitigation measures are already built in the government contract.
Okay. Apart from this, you were talking about ports and power projects. Do you have any experience of projects like, say, about education institutions or about healthcare institutions? Is a
Yes,
possibility of doing that project financing?
We have seen, sir. We have worked on a couple of financing wherein educational institutions or the hospitals or the societies have been funded. But sir, that lenders are normally not very enthusiastic about funding those kind of projects. And the reason is that one of the main reason is that all these institutions, whether it is educational institutions or the hospitals, they are always formed on a trust structure. So it's not a company, but it is a trust or society on which the project is housed. So the at the time of enforcement, sir, it becomes very difficult for the lenders to enforce, because unlike in case of a company, in case of a trust, the cash flows are insulated, and lenders do not have that kind of recourse which they have against a incorporated body or the special purpose company which has been incorporated for this purpose. So therefore, this trust structure or the society structure, and secondly, sir, as you know, they are not body incorporate. So whereas in case of a company can be a company is a body corporate, it has a corporate will. Trust or societies, they are not persons in legal sense. So therefore, lenders are normally not very enthusiastic about giving loan to these projects. In fact, sir, I'll just share one example with you, wherein we are working on a educational institution funding, and the structure was such that the land was housed in one company, and the trust and the trusts were only given the license to operate, and the schools were housed in trust. So the loan was given to trust, but the asset was not there. Asset was there with the company, which has leased out the assets to the trust. So these kind of complex structures are created by by these institutions, and that is where the lenders are very wary of funding these institutions, because then in this situation particularly, because loan has been granted to trust, so you don't have a recourse against the company, whereas all the assets are housed in the company and they are only leased to the trust for the running of the school purposes. So you cannot take trust into insolvency in that way. So therefore, they are they are not considered very happy situation for the lenders to fund. Having said that, we have seen some cases wherein lenders have funded the education institutions.
So we have one more question.
Yeah.
Again from Pulkit Zamindar, 50th year student. That how a real estate investment trust emerges as a financing option in current scenario for real estate projects.
So I think real estate investment trust, as a topic is a very broad topic. It's a very different topic. Is there a specific question or a specific concern which we want to discuss? Because once we start discussing REIT, which is real estate investment trust, it'll be altogether new jurisprudence, and you have to understand the concept of REIT in order to understand the interplay between project finance and REIT. So I guess maybe it can be covered in a specific session, which we, if at all, we take on REIT.
All right, sir. So I'll ask you a last call of questions and then we'll go up to session 2.
Sure.
All right. So if anyone has any questions, kindly please post up in the next 30 seconds. Or in other case, we'll move up to the session 2 of this.
Yeah, I think we can move to the next session.
All right, sir. So session 2 shall be dealing with the general discussion with the interplay between what is the life of a lawyer, what's the difference between the life of a lawyer in terms of in-house lawyering and in terms of law firms. What is the general expectations from an A0, or what is the general expectation from a candidate appearing before day 0 interviews? Questions like these will be taken by Anurag sir now. So I request Anurag sir to pick up the session, and I also request the participants that whoever wants to speak, kindly please write their name in the chat box and I'll call their name accordingly, such that there is no difficulty or disruption in the entire process. Thank you.
So, Gokul, I think you can display the answers which we had from the questionnaire from the second session. So you can start with question 1.
All right.
Yes. So the first question which I posed was, why do you want to become a corporate lawyer? And see, these questions I have taken because this will set the tone for the discussions, and some of your questions may get addressed here itself. So, if I see, 35% people have said their love for the commercial law. There are 31% people who are saying litigation is not for them. And there are 27% people who are saying that I want to make big money and retire at 50. And there are some of them which have also said that they hate sleeping and chilling with friends, therefore they want to join corporate law. So yeah, so very interesting. And as you see, all these questions, they are based on your perception. So therefore, there is nothing right or wrong in it. But I can only tell you what is my perception and why I wanted to become a corporate lawyer. So for me, the corporate lawyer corporate law per se interested because I wanted to see all those negotiations. And for me, the drafting of a contract kind of was very, very fascinating. And of course, some of it also has to do with the kind of exposure which you get in your initial years when you are seeing your seniors getting placed in all these big law firms, and then they come to campus and you see them coming in good cars and all those all that flashy lifestyle. So that also had a part to play in me deciding the corporate law, but mostly because I always wanted to be on a negotiation table with the other side. And somehow I thought that once you are into corporate law and once you are doing something, it is my way of contributing to the nation, because the contracts which you make, whether it is project finance, whether it is general corporate, whether it is mergers and acquisitions, you always draft those contracts which actually shape the nation. For example, somebody who has worked on a contract for Delhi International Airport, it's an asset to the nation, and you have worked on that particular contract, you've negotiated that contract, you know the nuances of that contract. So that is something which has always interests me, and therefore I wanted to be a corporate lawyer. And I'm happy to see that we have a good amount of good number of people who want to do and join corporate law. Can we move to the next one?
%.
That's very flattering. But 80% people out of the people who are present today, they want to work in a law firm. Okay, and 13% people, they want to do in-house lawyering, and I think 7% people want to start their own law firm. The statistics here itself, shows a lot. But if I can ask, do we have any volunteers who can tell why do you want to work in a law firm? If I can have only any one volunteer who can provide their perspective. Anyone? Let's say I pose a question to Gokul only because I know Gokul has been placed with Trial Legal, so definitely he wanted to join a law firm. So Gokul, what is your reason? Why do you wanted to join a law firm?
So I wanted to join a law firm because of the structure that it offers, the constant support, and in my initial years, because that is something that is not available when I go for a individual practice or something like that. The constant support from my seniors, the high quality of work that comes into the law firm, that is something that always attracts.
Right. So yeah, you're right. The quality of work which you get in a law firm, that is of course better in terms of you get to work on cream of the transactions, and you're always there as the main revenue earner of the project, as against an in-house lawyering where you are there as a support function. But both have their own pros and cons. So for example, if you're working in a law firm, work-life balance may be an issue for at least initial years. I would say not only initial years, actually till the time you're working in a law firm, you always have to, it is very difficult to have the work-life balance in that manner. The flip side is that you have a lot of good perks which you get working in a law firm. apart from the monetary compensation, that satisfaction which you derive working on the core areas of law, that gives you a lot of satisfaction. Whereas in-house lawyering is also very, very good. And we have seen a lot of people who have been to, in fact, I myself started a career from Hindustan Lever as an in-house lawyer. And that is also a good place to have exposures, and they have their own benefits. For example, the kind of facility and perks which you get in-house working, and the variety of work which you get working in in-house. For example, if you're working in, I'll give you my example. When I worked in Hindustan Lever, I had worked initial 2-3 years when I was working there. I had worked on each aspect of law, whether it is tax, whether it is litigation, whether it is consumer protection, whether it is criminal law, whether it is civil law, whether it is recovery suit, whether it is IPR. So you get a flavor of all the laws, and you get to work in all different areas of law. So therefore, that is the benefit of working in a law firm, working in-house. Whereas in a law firm, eventually you tend to specialize. So therefore, you may not entirely work on all these areas. So somebody is working in an IPR department from day one, the chances are that he'll keep on working in IPR. So therefore, it depends on what interests you ultimately, and what kind of preferences you have to decide whether you want to go to a law firm, whether you want to work in-house. Can we move to the next question? So the question was, do you believe corporate lawyers at law firm only make standard form of the contracts? I'm glad that at least 83% people believe that we do not make. And yes, there are 15% people who believe that we do make standard form contracts. This question has a little bit of background which I wanted to give you. So as I know, I am married to Monica Saroha, who is also an additional district judge in Delhi. And we live in a judicial officers complex. So I am surrounded by hundreds of judges. And trust me, whether I'm partner of Amachan or whether I'm a partner of Baker McKenzie, for most of them, I'm still a person who drafts the standard contracts, or rather, to use their what they say, कि आप तो standard contracts छापते हो ना. That is what they, that is what their impression is. So, and that is what the impression which most of the people outside the law fraternity has. But thankfully, I'm glad to see that at least 84% people here believe that no, we don't only make standard forms. Yeah, we can go to next question. So this is an interesting one. So, which characters do you relate most? And as expected, Harvey Specter 31%, Mike Ross 33%, Ellen Shore 25%. Oh, good. So Jolly also has a fan following. 10% people want to be like Jolly LB. That is great to know. So so while all of you may have your own reasons to follow these characters, and I think Suits or these kind of serials, they are the reason for many of us to having developed interest in the corporate law. For one, although at my point at my time when I was there in the college, I don't used to watch a lot of English series, and it was not that easily available for us. I'm talking about 20 years back or 15 years back. But see, while you may choose to follow whoever we are seeing here, what I wanted to emphasize was that what they show in the law firms, of course, all of you are aware of what happens in the law firm, but the reality as to what they show happens in the suits is not exactly what actually it happens really. So when you see Harvey Specter going there and just winning the negotiation in a flash of second by saying something, and the other side is totally floored. But that is not how it happens in negotiation, and you have to actually take out all the tricks which you may have learned, and depending upon what kind of counterparty you have, starting from using the legal jargons to actually come down speaking in Hindi. So it depends what kind of counterparty you have in front of the table, and you have to always mellow down or be aggressive based on the tone and tenor and the nature of the counterparty. And it does not so you cannot have one formula to negotiate a contract. So you cannot expect all the contracts to be negotiated aggressively, or all the contracts you want to be submissive. So therefore, you have to choose based on your own strengths and also the nature of the counterparty which is there in front of you. Then next question. So number of hours which you spend at law firm. So about 12 to 14, about 63% people have said 12 to 14 hours. 16% people have said 8 to 10 hours. And I think 17% people have said 16 to 18 hours. And yeah, there is a small margin which also says that we work 25 hours a day. So, and you would be surprised to know, yes, I mean, there are instances wherein law firms do bill clients for about 36 hours in a day. You may find it surprising, but yeah, there are cases wherein the law firms do bill clients for 36 hours. And that happens because then what happens, you are working on a particular research. That research may be used by multiple clients, so you may want to bill each client for the same time spent. So you may have spent 2 hours, but that 2 hours may be billed to 3 clients because the research topic is common. So yeah, we have billed the clients for more than 24 hours also. So yes, I mean that is a given that working hours in law firms are erratic, and during the starting years of your career, you have to be prepared to slog and to spend a lot of time in office. And you have to be prepared that it will not be that easy when you enter into profession. And it should not be also, because that time you have to establish yourself. You have to leave a mark for you, and that can be done only by putting in a lot of hard work, because you are learning many things for the first time. So you may take extra time to learn, and then you may be learning the drafting for the first time. So you tend to spend extra hours. In general, the law firms working hours are, of course, more than the in-house. For myself, I can tell you that there are days when I'm not able to join family dinners, and I have 2 kids. I've not been able to attend all their classes which are happening now, or I've not been able to spend time to make their assignments which we get at home. But yeah, that I compensate by attending all their parent-teacher meetings, going to their annual functions, and then whenever I can get time now, I would want to spend that time with them, learning new things, maybe going out for some amusement park or somewhere. So that way, you over a period of time, and when you go and become senior, you get control over your time, so you can plan your time accordingly in a law firm. So that is the benefit which you get as you become senior. You still spend same amount of time, but maybe you can manage your time better, so that it suits your daily routine. We can come to the.
Anurag, are you telling me now that you're a partner, you have more time to give at home? You want to say this in front of 200 people?
Let's not discuss this in this forum. Maybe we can take it offline.
So we have a question from Vartika Tiwari, a 50th student. Since you have moved from an in-house job to a law firm, could you throw some light on how smooth that transition was? What are the challenges that one faces when they move from an in-house job to a law firm?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So when you work in an in-house department, like I told you, you are a generalist. You're not working on a particular area of law. You're not specializing on that. So for example, when for me, the transition was a little bit smooth, because when I shifted to law firm, I was working with ILFS, and that too in their infrastructure department. So for 2 years of my time, which I spent there, mostly I was involved in drafting of the infrastructure contracts, negotiating with the government, drafting the bidding documents for the infrastructure projects, which is the bread and butter for an infrastructure lawyer. And when I shifted from in-house to a law firm called Link Legal India Law Services, which is again an infrastructure law firm. So that way, to an extent, my transition was not as hard as it ought to have been. But reason for that is not because of anything else, but because I was working in an in-house company, which was again specializing in infrastructure projects only. So that is how most of the work which I did at ILFS, I could put it to use when I shifted to Link Legal India Law Services. Having said that, all of you may not be in the same position. So generally, when you're working in-house and you move to a law firm, it is little difficult, but it is not that difficult also. It depends on which particular area you want to move in a law firm. So for example, if you are moving to, if you're working in a bank, let's say in-house department of a bank, and you want to move to litigation, then it may be difficult for you because in a bank corporate department you are not dealing with litigation. You're mostly dealing with the documentation. You are dealing with the Banking Regulation Act, RBI, FEMA, FERA, all these things, but you're not handling litigation. So therefore, then it may be difficult for you. But if you're working in a bank, let's say in a same banking finance department, and you want to move to a law firm which is doing project finance, and you want to move to project finance department, the transition may be smoother for you because you have seen the kind of documentation. You have a hang of the things which normally happen in a project finance transaction. Therefore, it may be easier for you. Having said that, still we have seen cases wherein people have come from the banks and they have done a lot of financing documentation, but they have struggled when they come to a law firm. That is not because of anything else, but because of the fact that you don't dive that deeper when you're working in-house, because you don't specialize and you always have the ability to outsource the work. So most of the in-house, for example, the documentation work of a project finance transaction is actually outsourced to a law firm. So while you may be working on a financing document from an in-house department, but that document is drafted by a law firm. So therefore, you may not have a hands-on experience or the first-hand experience of drafting a financing document. So therefore, to that extent, it may still be difficult. But I would say, nothing is that difficult that you cannot make a transition from in-house to a law firm. The only thing which I want to emphasize that it becomes easier in the initial years, say first 5, 6 years or 7 years, it is easier for you to move from in-house to law firm. As you become senior, it becomes difficult to move from in-house to a law firm because then the expectations are different. If you have a 6, 7 years of experience, the expectation in a law firm is that you will be running the transaction independently, which means that you'll be drafting, you'll be negotiating, you'll be interacting with the client independently. Whereas if you don't have that kind of experience in-house, then it may be difficult for you. So it is easier for you to, if you move initial years. But yes, we have seen cases where people have moved from in-house to law firm, even after spending 8, 9 years in in-house department.
Thank you, sir. That was really insightful. Now, I would request every participant, if you have any questions, to sir, they can open their microphones and ask sir any of the questions. Or if they feel they can write the question in the chat box, that will also suffice.
While we get questions from the participants, Gokul, I would request Uday sir or Mohanty sir to throw some light on this particular topic. Is someone saying something? Sorry. Sir, so with your experience, sir, what are the kind of things which you would want me to address here, or if you can throw some light from your perspective, sir, what are the things which they should be prepared? And Uday sir, Mohanty sir.
as you have seen, most of the students are interested in corporate, no? And when they
Right,
talk
sir.
about corporates, they, I think, probably look at the salary. The other issue is that many of the students who came from the middle class background would have got the money from a loan. So it's almost a necessity for them that to repay that loan either to parents or to the bank, and therefore a corporate job would be better. But what they don't know actually exactly is about the type of stress, the type of monotony, the type of lack of family time they have to be in a corporate job, and how to manage that. And I think that's now what you can say, that having a corporate job or expecting that in a law school is a necessary evil. But what they are not aware of that is that evil, and how to manage that things. No, see, actually, I must say about Anurag, you have remained fit, and thankfully for after even 10 years of work. So, how to remain fit, how to remain calm, and how to also contribute to society still in the job. So, these are certain things if you can highlight, and I think that will be, it's good for this young audience actually. Thank you.
Thank you, Tapan, sir. And that's very flattening, sir. Although I'm not that fit, but yeah, I mean, happy to hear that at least on the screen I am looking fit. So that's a solace. Sir. So sir, you're right. When we enter into the corporate world, normally, and for the initial few years, get very you get very blindsided with the kind of lifestyle which you get. Many of us, would be um, staying in five-star hotels, getting all those good dinners with the clients, flying in all these flights, and then staying at all these places, attending all these webinars, seminars, wherein we get to meet foreign clients and all these people. That may be overbearing at some point, and it is very important that we stay connected with the ground root, and we have to make sure that we kind of maintain a healthy lifestyle, sir. And although general perception is that if you work in a law firm, it is very difficult to maintain a healthy lifestyle. To an extent, it may be correct, sir. It is difficult as compared to if you're working in a house, or if you are a litigating lawyer. But I would say, sir, it is only as difficult or as easy as your determination is, because we have seen, and many of my colleagues who are working as a partner, who are burdened with the work, they still get time to do exercise. They still have their own time. So basically, it is very important for you to not get completely consumed in this corporate world. You have to have 1 hour or 2 hour of a day which is only for yourself, and wherein you devote that for your body, for your mental peace, for developing or pursuing your hobby. I know it is easier said than done, but we have examples in our law, in the entire law firm fraternity. You will see people who are able to strike that balance. You'll see people who are playing piano, who are playing, a mouth organ, who are playing, saxophone, and all these things, and people who are going for the rock climbing, who are going for trekking. So people do find out time for all this, and that is which actually gives you a lot of strength to carry on, because sometimes it may become a little monotonous, or sometimes it may become a little too much for you to handle. So therefore, you need to have these venting out windows wherein that time is dedicated for you. And then, of course, you have to have some amount of time for your family also. For one, like for example, for myself, it is very important to have some corner in my entire daily schedule to have time for my family. And on days when I'm not able to spend the time with my family, and there are a number of those days, I'm not that happy or satisfied. So therefore, then I try to make it up for during the weekend. But yes, as Tapan sir rightly suggested, it is very 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 important to have a healthy lifestyle, and also have some amount of time for yourself in your entire busy schedule.
So this is one query here. We have heard that why did you choose the law? Why did you choose corporate lawyership over other fields? At the same point in time, we also want to know that since we are also privileged that Monica ma'am is with us, and why Monica ma'am didn't wish to choose corporate lawyer as a profession, why did she choose other profession over corporate lawyer? Because at this point in time, we all are very much fascinated towards corporate lawyership as a job. But why Monika ma'am didn't choose this profession? A small question, sir.
Himanshu, Anurag only will answer this for me. I don't have permission from my High Court to speak today, so I can't be answering any questions today. But Anurag knows my reasons very well. He can, maybe if he wishes to, he can answer on my behalf.
Yeah, so see, I'll answer that, of course. So Monica joined judiciary because the reason for her were very different from the one which I told you, which are applicable on me. So see, what I understand, she always wanted to do some work which can make a difference at a grassroots level, which can make difference to the people's life. And I don't know whether you are aware, Himanshu, or not, but Monica started her career with this NGO called CHRI, Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. So she was always interested in doing some work which can make a difference in people's life immediately. You can see the difference in their life. You can see the results immediately. And that is why she started the career with an NGO, which is CHRI. And obviously, after working for a couple of years there, what she realized that, of course, NGOs do make a difference, but let's say judiciary, you are actually able to make a difference then and there in people's life. And that is what probably gives her a lot of satisfaction at the end of the day when she comes back home, and that she was able to serve justice to so many people, to make so many people's life better. I have seen her coming very elated when she has been able to pass some judgments and some in favor of some poor people who actually deserve that kind of order, and the happiness which you see in their faces, that is something which makes it totally worth it for her. Yeah, I think that is the reason she always wanted to come in this sector.
I'd like to add to what Anurag has been saying. We are waiting for somebody to become a High Court judge, and I think she is first in the line.
With your blessing, sir.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Any other questions which we have in the chat box or otherwise?
If anyone has any questions related to whatever they have in mind, they can actually ask right now. Either write in the chat box or open your microphone and speak by yourself. The floor is entirely open to you.
Sure. So if we don't have any further questions, then I think we can end the session now. And I would like to thank MCA and all the teachers who are present here and the entire NLIU fraternity for giving me this opportunity to share my views. And also, I'm very happy that I hope that my answers have been able to satisfy some of your queries relating to career or otherwise. And thank you so much.
So I'm sorry, sir, to interrupt you, but we have questions right now.
Oh, okay, no problem. Go ahead.
So we have a question from Nupur Padi, a 5th year student.
Mm-hmm.
So as much as it is beneficial for a fresh recruit to go through the rotation policy in law firms, where it is compulsory for its own skill development, is it a dissuading factor for someone who necessarily wants to pursue one area? And so, does it become criteria while applying for placement?
Oh, so see, rotation policy for a fresher who is joining fresh out of college is not a bad thing at all. See, because even though you may be wanting to specialize in a particular area, but I believe initial few years it is always better to have worked on as many areas of law as it is possible. So if you join in a law firm and you are in a rotation policy, and so you get to work on different spheres of law. And when we talk about specialization, yes, at to an extent, ultimately you're joining a law firm, you want to specialize, but initial few years wherein you get the opportunity to work in each area, or at least substantial amount of areas are covered, that comes very handy for you when you are actually going toward the specialization. So for example, if you let's say in terms of, if you want to do M&A, if you want to do if you want to join an M&A team, and you have also worked in the projects team, if you also worked in project finance team, you have conducted diligences, you have seen the kind of contract which a project company has. Then you have also worked in the competition team, wherein you learn the basic traits of the competition law. Because see, ultimately, no area is exclusive. So when you do an M&A transaction, it also has a play of the projects area. It also has a play of the project finance area. It also has a play of the competition law. It also has an element of taxation. It also has an element of litigation. So if you have a basic hang of each area, at least what it entails, it is always helpful. I would say, in fact, even some bit of flair of litigation or some amount of experience in litigation is always helpful. Is also helpful, because then nobody is able to take you for the ride when you are going for a negotiation, a contract, simply saying that, oh, the stay has not come. Or let's say somebody will say that, okay, it takes 90 days to get a stay. If you have done the litigation or you have seen your basic idea, you would be able to say, no, you're wrong. Even 90 days is not sufficient to get a stay in an Indian context. And you may require 6 months to 1 year sometimes to get a stay. But that you will come to know only if you have worked on those areas. So therefore, no area is exclusive. Specialization only means that you have done a deep dive in a particular area to know the critical nuances to consummate a transaction. But during that process, you have to have a basic idea of each law, every law. So therefore, rotation is always good, and it has no impairment on when you sit for the interview. In fact, initially, of course, when you make your CVs, you want to show some kind of focus in your CV that this is the area of interest. But being a generalist or saying that I've worked in a number of areas, it never hurts and it never dissuades you, or it is not a detrimental when you go for the campus placement interviews.
Thank you, sir. So we have one question from Tanya Satya. Question is that I would like to know that what are your expectations from an intern? What all things should we keep in mind?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm glad somebody asked it. So see, for an intern, the first and foremost requirement anyone in a law firm has is that, one, that interns should be punctual. Second, that interns should always be attentive and dedicated to whatever work is being given. So, and third, you have to have the a general basic decorum of the office has to be maintained. These are the very general three things, but these things are what gets you noticed, or what gets you because your first impression as an intern is very, very important. So on the first day of your internship, if you reach late, that may not fetch however technically good you may be, but that may end your kind of a potential opportunity then and there. So apart from these three things, then comes the willingness to learn and do whatever is provided. So see, because what happens, interns, you may not always get best of the research work when you go to a law firm. So sometimes you may also get the work kind of proofreading. Sometimes you may be asked to go for a negotiation, just sit there and observe. Sometimes you may also be asked to assist in execution, wherein you will be asked to count the signed pages, see that all the pages are signed or not. But all these works are also preparing yourself for your later year when you join as an associate in a firm. So no single work is demeaning. All these works, even when you join as a law firm as an associate, you still may be doing some of this work for a very for initial few years of your career. So therefore, it prepares you for that kind of work. And then, of course, if you get some research work from some senior, try to see that you have captured all the points. Try to be very, very thorough, and always try to be, don't try to just copy paste from here and there. Just, try to be more insightful. Read books. That is one thing which I tell everyone, that in this day and age, normally we rely on the Google and Manupatra and SEC online, and we don't have the habit of reading commentaries. But if you read commentaries, you get to know new things which you will not find an answer, in Google. And when you read commentary, what happens? You read the context. You don't just read one para. You read the para above that and para below that. You read the context. You get the context why this particular provision was inserted in a particular statute. So that gives you a lot of help when you're actually thinking or negotiating or drafting that particular thing. So that is why, as an intern, the expectation is that whatever you do, you should be very thorough. You should not copy paste blindly from anywhere, even if you're relying on the online sources. Second, whatever you are providing to your senior, it should always be supported by the sources that from where you have picked up, because they are very much interested in that. And nobody will take your word for it. They would want to know from where this particular statement or sentence or the principle of law is coming. Yeah, so these are the things which you have to keep in mind. And also, just one thing, and this is I wanted to tell, I keep on telling whoever interns in our office, that when you go as an intern outside world, in a law firm or in a house or wherever, you go as a representative of the college. So you are the flag bearers of the NLIU. So therefore, you should always keep in mind that when anyone sees that intern, they see the intern as NLIU student or NLIU pass out or NLIU potential candidate. So your one mistake or your disinterest there may actually have a repercussion for the entire college. So therefore, all of you actually owe that responsibility to each one, that you should have that kind of impression. You should leave that impression of your college, that people keep on recalling the students from NLIU again.
Unmute yourself.
Do we have any further questions, Gokul? Or
Yes. So we have a question.
okay.
How important is it for the student to have an understanding of the general basic laws outside their CV while preparing for an interview? Because generally they say that CV is the grand norm, and post that you look for the general basic laws. So how important it is for an interview perspective?
See, from an interview perspective, since you are a student, nobody expects you to know all laws, number one. So what is the expectation in an interview? Expectation in an interview is twofold. Number one, that you should show the earnest, that you really want that job. So how will you show your earnest? One, that you should have done a very thorough research of the institution which you are going an interview for, which means the history of the institution, what areas they are into, how are they performing, what are the new areas they are venturing into. All these knowledge, this knowledge comes very handy if you have to actually make one or two statements about the company, because that will show that you have really done your homework about the company or you are prepared. Number two, whatever you write in your CV, that is something which should be mastered by you. So you cannot mention. So for example, because these 5 years you may be you are taught number of laws, and like I said, nobody expects you to know all the laws when you are a student, and nobody expects you to mug up those laws also. So therefore, what is important is that whatever you write in your CV, that has been prepared by you, that is by heart to you, and you have mastered that. So let's say if you've written an article on the plea bargaining, then you should be prepared to answer questions on plea bargaining deep dive. So that is one area, because the expectation is that you have done a work on that, you have written an article, then you have done a thorough research on that, and that gives you a context. That gives you context to the interviewer also to ask the relevant questions, and they judge you basis what you have written in your CV and how much prepared you are on those. Of course, if you have an extra knowledge, that always helps. But if you're not able to answer a general question of law, unless it is very, very basic and conceptual, let's say principles of the contract. So what are the basic principle to have a valid contract? What are the ingredients of a basic contract? This is something very, very basic, and everyone would expect to know you. But beyond that, it will be mostly restricted around your CV. So, and you can you can actually derive your interview based on your CV. You can have leading questions. So once you answer one particular question, in that question itself, you drop a hint so that interviewer picks that hint and props in the next question. So you can very well derive your interview in that manner. So two things. One is that you have to have very thorough research about the organization where you're going an interview for, and second, you have to have a very, very thorough in whatever you have written in your CV. That should be prepared. Everything else is kind of still fine.
Thank you, sir. That was a really insightful input. We have, sir, one more question from Rihanna Mukherjee of 4th year. So, considering that internship methods have changed in the light of pandemic, do you have any suggestions with respect to the conduct of interns during a virtual internship?
Yes, that's a very good question. What is the name of the student who had asked it?
Sir, Rihanna Mukherjee, a 4th year student.
Rihanna. Thanks, Rihanna. That's a very good question. And it's very relevant in today's time, because you see this pandemic is going to be there for some time. So we are looking at least, minimum 6 more months of a virtual interaction. So first and foremost is the etiquettes, which you have to keep in mind. So your dressing sense, you should be dressed in formal when you are going for the internship. So during the office hours, you have to have the formal dress. You cannot be seen, wearing something, round neck t-shirt or your slippers at home. Although slippers are not visible, but to whatever extent you are there in the screen, it should be it should be fit to the occasion. So it should be formal dressing. Number two, you should always have, so like when we are speaking, you should always have your videos on when you are speaking to, so which means that when you are doing an internship during the office hour, you should be prepared that you may have to come anytime on the screen for briefing the senior, for preparing it. And you should also, these IT skills come very handy. So you should have you should hone your presentation skills, preparing the presentations, writing articles, all those things will come handy. And the third thing is that because it's a virtual world, so ideally you should be available, throughout the day. So you should not have the mental block that I will work only from, 9 to 5 or say 9 to 6. And after 6 o'clock, if some senior is giving you work, you're generally not available. Even if you're not there, let's say if you've gone out, you should politely say that, I'm out of this thing right now. I'm out of home and I'll be back, allow me some time, I'll be back and then I'll be doing, because most of the time you'll be at home. So while you may not be working on all the time, but the expectation is that you should be available, throughout the day at least.
I had a question in mind. What are the general expectations from an A0 video firm?
Okay. So for an A0, the general expectation is that the person would be able to carry on the instructions very, very clearly. Second is that your general drafting skills is being tested. So you should have a fair drafting skills. It is improving as you learn, as you move up the ladder based on the experience. But the basic drafting should be there. Elementary mistakes should not be there in a draft, because that is what makes you trustworthy. So the senior who has given you work while the conceptual mistakes can be still pardonable because you are not expected to know all the concepts from day one, and that is why you are there and you are being learning those concepts with the help of seniors. But the elementary mistakes like typos, comma, full stop. So the document which you are sending to the senior from your side, it should be pitch perfect. There should not be grammatical mistakes. There should not be formatting errors. There should not be any other kind of elementary mistakes. The instructions which are carried out by you, whatever instructions which have been passed on by the seniors, all of them should be followed. Should not. So let's say if there are 4 instructions said in one sentence, you should be able to carry out all 4. You should not be. It should not be that you forget one instruction, because initial years what you're making, you're making yourself very trustworthy. You're developing that trust, and this is that trust only which actually encourages the senior to give you more work. So if you are able to have his trust or that kind of rapport with the senior, that will help you to get some good work in your initial years. And also the for the initial years, you because you will remain mostly in the background, so you have to be very thorough with your work. Whatever work you're doing, it should be very thorough. Mostly, see, in a corporate world, AGROs are doing lot of diligences. So in a due diligence exercise, whatever contracts you're reviewing, your review should be very thorough. You should be capturing everything, and you are expected to ask lot of questions. So you should not shy away from asking questions, because like I said, nobody expects you to know the the law, full law, or nobody expects you to know the nuances of the transactions. So the more you ask, the better clarity comes to you, and nobody minds asking you a number of questions. Sometimes some seniors may just they may be busy, they may ask you to come later, but then you take time from them, but make sure that you are asking relevant questions. You keep on asking questions. That is how you learn.
Thank you, sir, for providing such an insightful input. So I'll ask anyone any questions. This will be the last call, considering the time limits that we have. Anyone that has any question, they can open their microphones or they can write in the chat box. Sir, I think a lot of our questions were actually dealt with during the course of the discussion, during the course of the experiences and everything. So on behalf of the Moot Court Association, Placement Coordination Committee, and I thank you for taking up this session and guiding us through nuances of the project finance, because that is something more practical aspect of law. So I really thank you for taking up the session to make us understand basics and what nuances are with respect to project finance laws. We really be obliged to hold more sessions, such more sessions in areas with, as of what Alam sir suggested, the immutable rules. We would love that to happen, sir, in future. That's I would thank you, and I would also like to thank all the participants for being for asking questions, for showing us such a great enthusiasm for this session. That's thank you, sir. I would like to end the session.
Thank you so much, Gokul. Thanks, MCA, and I would especially like to thank all the participants for such, that shows the interest, the kind of interest which I have seen in this session. It is very rare to see such kind of interest, and I'm glad that I've been able to, my talk here has helped you in some manner, and I thank the faculty who has taken out the time to be here. And thank you so much. Look forward to these kind of sessions again. And definitely, Gokul, you can come back to us and we can plan a session as suggested by Alam sir, whenever the schedule permits. And thank you so much. It's a pleasure to come back to Alma Mater. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.